May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts be pleasing to you, our God, our strength and our Redeemer. Well, my name is John Sains. Some of you know that already, and that's a joy to me. I'm here as a priest for this parish of Gosford during the interregnum. This means I help keep this ship of faith moving in the direction set over these recent times, and to help keep our focus of building community, growing spiritually in our humanity as women and men of faith, and working for human rights and social justice. You'll discover that some things we do also change, begin to change. That's the nature of, because I'm different to Father Rod. And Father Rod, as you know, has left us, and we still grieve that, I'm sure. But Lent is also a season of change. It's a season for digging down into our roots, as I will suggest in a while. But those same ministry priorities I want to keep in the forefront of our thinking, being and acting as followers of Jesus. We are the laos of God, the people of God, and I am a member of that laos with you. But I'm also in the order of priesthood or presbyter, and actually, biblically, we're presbyters, not priests so much, which means elder. So I am the elder laos among you. But we together share ministry. It's the ministry of the laity, of the people of God. It's not just mine, it wasn't just Rod's. I know that was his view as well. So my hopes in this interregnum is to assist this ministry of the laos. And so I'm going to be drawing some of you out, some of you who already do things, I hope, without overstressing myself or others or using more time than I need to. But that's also why I want to draw some of you out. So as we return to more normal post-COVID times, I don't want to be the only one up here in this sanctuary in the church, because this sanctuary needs to reflect the community. So I want men and women up here as well. So I want to draw some of you out who haven't had these roles, and I'd like to see you develop them. If we could just have a slide. Yesterday, this tweet came from a colleague in the UK, Martin Percy. Well, he's not so much a colleague as someone I know, but who's quite well known there. And he posted this just yesterday morning. Now, this is a picture taken from Kiev in the morning of that day, and the clouds that were forming an image of the angel over the city where the main cathedral's it sits, and that cathedral is dedicated to the Archangel Michael, who cast Lucifer into hell. We have to look to the signs of the times, don't we? And gosh, if this isn't a sign. On Saturday, many of us gathered on the Central Coast for the World Day of Prayer. Some of you might have gone to that here. I happen to be speaking at the one in Woy Woy. And we drew inspiration from Jeremiah's letter to the exiles in Babylon around the 7th century. Jeremiah's words were very prescient. He spoke to the people of Israel and Judah in a time of great turmoil. The brutal Assyrian Empire at the time had brought the kingdom of Israel to its knees, and it was also about to be the case that the power of Babylon was on the rise, so they were going to come and try and squash Assyria. So the people of Israel and Judah and around that area were in the middle of all this, and they were carted off. The leaders of that community were carted off to Babylon and lived there in exile. Unfortunately, today words like empire still ring true among us. They ring loudly in our ears at the situation in Ukraine, where Putin is endeavouring to build an empire again. Despots do this, but despots have short memories, don't they? If they only read the scriptures, which they claim to be part of, they would realise that the empires of Assyria and Babylon passed. Empires will come and go, but the empire of God is the one that never goes. And this is the empire which we need to seek. Our hearts go out at this time to those who are suffering at the hands of empire. There are countless places around the world where this is the case, and I think our prayers today, or at least our confession from that service, helped us also realise that we have been part of this ourselves. So we need in some ways to redress what our ancestors have done, because we reap the benefits of what has happened in the past. But we also want others to know the benefits as well. So that's why we need to also come with wisdom and repentance in the face of empires, knowing that we've been there and done that as well. So these are unsettling times. So it's appropriate that in the face of all this, we're again coming around to Lent. What I love about the church year is whatever's going on, it brings us back all the time to focus on God. Different seasons, slightly different theologies, different themes, different practices are suggested. But that's the case because the church in its wisdom is endeavouring to help us in our practices, in our spiritual journey, not to be overtaken by the empires, because they will. I have to say, since the war in Ukraine, I've realised I've had to stop looking at the news so much and stop reading social media. I was starting to get anxious myself and I realised it. And so now, especially before going to bed, I don't look at any of that stuff. Well before that, and I read my novel, which happens to be Dune. If you see the movie, you'll wonder what on earth is peaceful about that, but it's a good novel. So these are our practices, and Lent is bringing us to think about practices like that. What is it we're doing at the moment that can help us move past anxiety, for example, and to be in a place where we're standing on solid rock? Now Lent, if I ever knew this I'd forgotten, but Lent comes from the Anglo-Saxon word which means spring. Now that's a lovely thought, isn't it? Spring is the season of growth. But growth only comes from deep down, doesn't it? In the darkness of where the seed is placed, in the dark soil. And Lent invites us also to do that kind of reflection, to sit on our own, and also to dig deep. And the practices that we are invited in Lent to perform and to enter into afresh: reflection, fasting and prayer. Reflection, fasting and prayer. My wife and I actually happen to try to fast one night a week in Lent. I'm not telling you this to brag, because I tell you it's not easy. We do that. I think this week, this Lent, we're doing it on a Friday night. It's not such a big thing, but it's interesting because not having the meal, we sit and talk, and it causes us to reflect and pray as well. So this is a time for reflection, fasting and prayer. And it's a time, I think, if you're like me, prayers will probably go on through the day a bit. You know, when you meet an obstacle and you think, Lord, deal with that, or something like that. But this is inviting us to take that little extra time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, or maybe 20, just doing it. Because what this does is it helps us feed into the fecundity of God. That's what the seed does in the soil. It's the nutrients in that dark and the humus. And those practices help us also to delve into the fecundity of God. Fecundity has to do with the way of the kingdom, to God's reign, to God's empire. Empires will come and go, but this empire will never go. And this empire is known through service of love of enemy, even love of neighbour, and doing good for others. Going back to our roots. Now, interestingly, there's another word that relates to going to the roots, and that is the word radical. It's a radical thing. You do not realise how radical it is that you come to worship. You don't realise how radical it is that you might spend 5 minutes in prayer. You don't realise how radical it is that you might get on the side of the Central Coast and stand up for refugees. This is what the nature of the kingdom is like. It's radical. And I think then part of what being radical is, or going to our roots, is going back in our roots. And that's what Deuteronomy, that's reading from Deuteronomy, is about. They are invited to recite their story. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. They went back into Egypt and lived there as aliens, few in number, and there they became a great nation, mighty and populous. Why do we go back in our story? We go back in our story of faith, and so that's not only the faith of the tradition, we do that as well, but let's go back in our own stories during Lent, where we've connected with faith and where we've found the journeys difficult, where we've found the light along the way, and do what these folk in Deuteronomy are doing. They're showing gratitude, they're realising what was done, and they're expressing gratitude on telling this story. They realise, yes, God took us out of slavery into the promised land. So think about those things in your life where you can be grateful and name them maybe every night before you head to sleep. Empire and war in Ukraine reminds me of similar times, of course, and I want to leave you with a thought from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom I think you've heard of, a Lutheran pastor, theologian and a martyr. He was imprisoned by the Nazis and died in 1944, was murdered by them in the Tegel prison camp. World War II was nearing the end. He was still in prison, but his godchild was about to be baptised. So he wrote to the godchild from prison, reflecting about his situation where the German church had compromised with Nazism, where the confessing church, which he was part of, was seeking to be prophetic, and that's why he was in trouble. He wrote to this godchild, and the godchild probably couldn't understand what was in this letter yet, but he would have years later. But I think these words are appropriate to us. We can be Christian today in only two ways: through prayer and in doing justice among human beings. All Christian thinking, talking and organising must be born again out of that prayer and action. Prayer and doing justice among human beings. In this time where we feel unsettled, not only by empires but by pandemics, changes in our community, going back to our roots, I think, is going back to prayer and doing justice among human beings. And I leave you with that thought to take with you as you recall times where you have been grateful to God for God in your life.